In an attempt to end the Pacific War, the United States bombed the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August of 1945, leveling the two cities and destroying thousands of lives. However, such an attack finally led to Japan's ultimate surrender, ending the war and releasing its colonies such as Korea from Japanese rule. Japan was placed under American rule under the authority of the Far Eastern Commission, which sat in Washington. Under the period of American occupation from 1945 to 1952, the United States restructured the Japanese society by making it more open to Western culture. It created a new constitution which stated that Japan will forever renounce war. It rebuilt schools and forced the emperor to deny his divinity. Almost 1,000 criminals were sentenced to death. The United States wanted Japan to become its ally and saw the need to rebuild the image of Japan. Perhaps this was the reason why Japan never truly acknowledged its involvement in the Pacific War, choosing instead to remain silent. Japan never mentioned or discussed the atrocities they committed during the war. It was even said that Japan's crimes during the war far outranked those committed by the Nazis. The idea of a superior race was prevalent among Japanese soldiers during the war, and even to this day, they would claim that their atrocities were done in the name of the emperor. The United States, during the time of the occupation, sought to demystify the image of the emperor, who was thought to be a god or led a life that was secluded. The Americans wanted to use Emperor Hirohito's image, which was why he was never tried for war crimes. Japan's denial or silence in its involvement in the Pacific War proves that Japan has probably not come to terms with what they have done. Journalist Brian Bremer had this to say about Japan's silence. Japan's inability to squarely confront its past in relation to the war is an insult to the memory of the millions of Japanese who died in the Pacific theater. Maybe Japan does not want to acknowledge their involvement in the war because it wants to suppress this part of their past. Perhaps it is because of pride that their surrender was shameful. All these are just mere speculation of why Japan chose to hide from this part of their past. A full-scale civil war between the Gumendang and the Communists erupted immediately after World War II. By this time, the Gumendang had been fatally weakened. In addition, the increasingly corrupt government of Chiang Kai-shek further spread disillusionment. The struggle for political power, which started in the 1920s, ended in 1949, the Communists emerging as the winner. On October 1 of the same year, Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China.
Late 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek's forces had moved up from the south and were once again on the point of launching a major attack. Help came from an unexpected quarter. China's old enemy, Japan, invaded, committing appalling atrocities against the civilian population. Mao seized the opportunity to forge an unlikely alliance with Chiang Kai-shek in the name of repelling the foreign invader. It came just in time.
The Japanese invasion allowed Mao, honorably and with much popular support, in effect to force Chiang Kai-shek to desist from his attacks on the communists and to form an anti-Japanese alliance.
3 years later, China and Japan were sucked into World War II. America sent aid and advisors to help Mao fight the Japanese. At the end of the war, with American help, the communists had become stronger and better equipped than ever before. In 1949, after a series of running battles with government troops, Mao's communist guerrillas overran the country and marched into the capital, Beijing. The peasant revolution had triumphed. America had inadvertently helped arm the man who was to become one of the most powerful communist leaders in the world. Mao was 55 and the most successful guerrilla leader of the 20th century. But even bigger challenges lay ahead. On October 1st, 1949, in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China. It was the end of a 30-year civil war.
After touring China, Mao concluded that the Chinese people were capable of anything. The two primary areas that he felt they should target was industry and agriculture. Mao announced a 5-year plan to last from 1958 to 1963, which was later known as the Great Leap Forward, in which China is expected to overtake Britain in industrial output. Mao moved beyond the Soviet model of collectivization and organized lands into communes. The size of a commune varied in area and population but averaged to about 15,000 to 25,000 people. Private ownership was also abolished and enterprises were collectively managed. The 5-year program, which only lasted 3 years, ended in catastrophe, inducing a famine that produced an estimated 20 to 43 million deaths. Mao admitted the failure and had to step down as head of state. Governance of China was left to the moderates, Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping. In late 1960, they abandoned the Great Leap Forward and private ownership of land was reinstated.
In 1958, Mao left Beijing for one of his periodic tours of the country. He was impatient with the slow pace of change and worried that the revolution had lost its momentum. He felt it was time to shake up the country and rekindle the old enthusiasm.
Mao was someone who believed in movement. He loved upheaval. He said so to his doctor, and it's quite clear from the way he behaved. That was part of his personality. It was part of why he liked the martial life, the guerrilla existence. That was what revolution was.
As Mao roamed the country, he was suddenly struck by the huge potential of China's vast army of workers. If the country lacked modern machinery, it had more human muscle power than anywhere else in the world. That summer, he set about galvanizing it into action. He called it the Great Leap Forward, a massive mobilization of China's millions.
To be fair to Mao, a lot of economists in the 1950s and 60s said that bootstrap development was the way to go, getting the peasants to build local industry. What was wrong was that he went overboard in what could be done. He heard Khrushchev saying he was going to overtake America in 15 years, so he said, well, we'll overtake someone. We'll overtake Britain in 15 years. Madness.
The effects were felt almost immediately. In the countryside, there was a huge reorganization of farming. In less than 12 months, 900 million peasants, almost 4 times the population of the United States, were pushed and cajoled into enormous collective farms. Grain production was expected to quadruple. But Mao had even bigger plans. The country needed to produce more steel. Why shouldn't China's millions help the country to jump decades and industrialize overnight? A decree went out. The country turned into a nation of steelmakers. That year, the night sky glowed orange as millions of tiny blast furnaces were built in every village and workplace. Many people had nothing to put in them.
We went to the homes of our colleagues to collect scrap metal. And later we couldn't find any scrap metal. And we took the heater and just cracked them into scrap metal. It's really something It's just unimaginably crazy, but we did all that.
The Great Leap Forward turned into the greatest mobilization of human beings the world has ever seen. Reports poured in of fantastic increases in output. Mao wanted to hear good news, and with memories of the anti-rightist purges still fresh in the country's memory, nobody was willing to contradict him.
Mao became deaf and blind. He was isolated and ill-informed, like an emperor in his palace.
The following year, the truth seeped out. Most of the steel was useless. Worse, in the fervor to produce it, the harvest had simply not been collected for 2 years.
In 1958, 59 or thereabouts, I had the impression that Mao was really divorced from the world around him, the Chinese people. He knew how to organize a revolution, but he did not know how to run a country.
By the winter of 1959, as a result of Mao's ambitions, China had been pushed into an appalling famine. Whole villages died of starvation.
When the grass and tree bark had gone, people were left with nothing at all to eat. When there was nothing else, they ate the bodies of the recently dead. I'll tell you a true story. A husband said to his wife, "If we all try to survive, none of us will make it. I'm going to give you my food, and when I die, I want you to eat my body and raise our child."
Nobody knows how widespread such cannibalism was. But recent estimates suggest around 40 million people died of hunger between 1959 and 1961. It was the worst man-made famine in history. But the scale of the disaster was concealed from the country. Only the Communist Party leadership knew the reality. Mao was quietly pushed to the sidelines, and his rival, Liu Shaoxi, a pragmatic politician, took over the running of the country. For the first time in 25 years, Mao was forced to take a back seat. He would spend the next 5 years plotting his return to power.
The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, was launched by Chinese Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong to stem what he perceived as the country's drift away from the socialism and toward the restoration of capitalism. The campaign, which was euphorically described as its inception by its progenitors as a great revolution that touches people to their very souls, and which inspired radical students from Paris to Berkeley, is now regarded as having been a terrible catastrophe for the Chinese nation.
Mao was convinced the country's moderate leadership was reintroducing capitalism. With a total disregard for the normal process of political change, he urged the students to root out what he called capitalist roaders, by which he meant his political opponents. China was gripped by what became known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution.
Mao was a very purposeful manipulator of the political process. He was creating chaos very, very purposefully as a way of getting control of the party. He was not crazy. He understood that what he was doing in creating these conflicts was weakening his opposition so that he could reestablish his own authority, his own control.
Chaos spread through China like a whirlwind as Mao's Red Guards set about purging political moderates. Many of his victims were his traditional enemies, the intellectuals. Chen Yizi dared to write a letter to Mao calling for more democracy.
I was taken over 100 times to be denounced. I was beaten insensible 3 times. I was so exhausted, I could easily have died. And in fact, I didn't want to live. 4 members of my family were killed because I was accused of being a counter-revolutionary.
Families were destroyed. Parents were pulled away from their children. In my husband's office, they were actually torturing people to death. They would wrap them in a quilt and beat them to death. And then they would throw their bodies out the windows and call it suicide.
Mao was back in command. At a rally of the Communist Party in 1969, he received a hysterical welcome from his supporters. He had no qualms about exploiting his new popularity. As Red Guards swept through the country, he shamelessly indulged his old appetite for young women.
You had to think of Mao as this rock singer multiplied by a factor of 10. You touch him, it's like, you know, you will never be the same again. Young women would want to be with him or serve him in any way.
By the end of the 1960s, over 1 million people had been killed or imprisoned by the Red Guards. Mao's opponents had been hounded out of power. Even he now realized it was time to restore order. The Red Guards were disbanded. Many were sent to cool off in the country. After years of chaos in China, Mao now sought to break the country's isolation in the world. It would be his last major initiative.
The standoff between China and Japan over disputed islands in the East China Sea brings the two sides closer to armed conflict than at any time since the Second World War. After the war, the islands known as the Senkakus in Japan and the Diaoyu Islands in China were under American administration until they were handed back to Japan in 1972. Japan says they have long been its territory and admits no dispute, claiming also that China only started expressing an interest when it began to seem that oil and gas might lie under the sea. But China says they have always been part of China, just what it says about Taiwan, which also claims the Diaoyus. This is the most active and dangerous dispute, but not the only one in which Japan is embroiled. It was furious in 2012 when South Korea's president, Lee Myung-bak, visited the island South Koreans call Dokdo and Japan claims as Takeshima. It is a mirror of Japan's dispute with China. South Korea is in control. Then there are what Japan calls its northern territories. Occupied by the Soviet Union in the dying days of the war, these islands, the southernmost 4 of the Kuril chain, are still administered by Russia. Because of the dispute, Japan and Russia have yet to sign a peace treaty ending the Second World War. Maritime claims in Southeast Asia are even more complex, and competition is made more intense by speculation that the South China Sea might be hugely rich in oil and gas. China, Taiwan and Vietnam all say they have sovereignty over the Paracel Islands, controlled by China since it evicted the Vietnamese from them in 1974. To the south, the same 3 countries also claim the Spratly Archipelago, but there and elsewhere in the sea, the Philippines also has a substantial claim. Malaysia also claims some islands. Even tiny Brunei has an interest. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and its tribunal, is one forum for tackling these disputes. But UNCLOS cannot rule over territorial disputes, just over the territorial waters and exclusive economic zone the owners of habitable islands are entitled to. And the claims of China and Taiwan may have nothing to do with UNCLOS. They point to a map published in the 1940s, showing a big U-shaped 9-dashed line around the edge of the sea. That, they say, is historically all China's. This has no basis in international law, and China often fails to clarify whether its claims are based on the 9-dashed line or claims to islands, rocks and shoals. That lack of clarity alarms not just its neighbours and rival claimants, but the United States, which says it has its own national interest in the freedom of navigation in a sea through which passes a huge chunk of global trade.
South China Sea, or locally dubbed as the West Philippine Sea, is composed of 3 islands, namely Pratas, Paracel, and Spratleys, with their Chinese appellations as Dongsha, Sija, and Nansha respectively. China has laid claim over these islands for historical reasons. Spratleys are a group of more than 750 reefs, islets, atolls, cays, and islands in the South China Sea. The discovery of hydrocarbon reserves that may boost the depleted resources of developing countries, the West Philippine Sea's diverse marine life, as well as declining fish stocks within claimant countries' borders, expanding military and law enforcement capabilities, and growing nationalism have become only some of the potential dispute drivers in the area.
For China, we say our ancestors used to occupy this island. So I have this book to show. Look, and my fishermen used to use the island to avoid a typhoon. It's all recorded. And there are so many vessels unearthed that carry Chinese porcelain. It's not a Vietnamese porcelain. So we consider that 1,000 years ago, our people already used this sea lane of communication for China's interest. Therefore, the ancestors of them have the right to claim.
An editorial in the Global Times, published by the Chinese Communist Party mouthpiece, the People's Daily, was even tougher, warning that, quote, China will never waive its right to protect its core interests with military means. Beijing's assertiveness was coupled with intense pressure on Southeast Asian nations to negotiate their differences with China bilaterally, where, of course, China, given its size and clout, would have a significant advantage.
There are some things that because you are so big and the other side is so small, if you do bilateral, that means you are engaging in unfair negotiation. So I think the South China Sea is becoming a sensitive spot today precisely because so many countries there are getting very uneasy about China's presence, the position of the Chinese government since 1949. So say, in the time of Chairman Mao, the central government says we claim sovereignty over these islands. And today, any leadership, if you will come in and say, I think we probably need to give away that kind of sovereignty, no leadership can do this.
Long list of divergent interests troubling U.S.-China relations, therefore, a new one can now be added: how to handle the potentially volatile conflict over the South China Sea.
The Soviet Union's entry into the Pacific War on August 8, 1945, led American planners to realize that Korea was about to fall under Soviet rule. They saw this as a danger to Japan, a country that they wanted to ally themselves with. To block the Soviet advance, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, allowing the Soviets to occupy the north and the Americans to occupy the south. After its division, the United States and Soviet forces hoped to find a way to launch Korea into an independent state through a trusteeship formula. This never happened. The South saw this move as nothing more than a new form of colonialism. When the United States tried to abandon this trusteeship formula, the Soviets accused the Americans of not following their agreements and of being anti-communist. With this, the division became permanent. In 1950, Kim Il-sung, with the support of the Soviet Union, attacked the South in an effort to unify the country once more. He was able to occupy Seoul, the capital of South Korea, for a short period of time. Kim Il-sung's invasion led to the United Nations labeling the North as aggressors and created the peacekeeping force led by MacArthur. The peacekeeping force eventually drove the invaders out of South Korea, and the boundary was restored. This became known as the Korean War. Negotiations for peace started in 1951, but it was only in 1953 that an armistice was signed. This agreement officially divided the country, and to this day, the two Koreas are still, technically, in a state of war.
We were invited for the celebrations of the great leader's birthday, the founder of the country, Kim Il-sung. Although he died in 1994, his birthday is the most revered day in the calendar. Only those with impeccable politically correct backgrounds are allowed to live here in the capital, Pyongyang. And, not surprisingly, they all march to the same tune.
Not only did our great leader liberate our country, build it up and make us the happiest people on earth, but he's the most respected among world leaders.
And so you're giving him flowers?
Yeah, it's the whole heart of people.
But I believe he's dead.
Yes, he had passed away in 1994. 16 years have passed since then.
And the fact that you give him flowers today, does this mean that you think he is a god, that he is immortal?
Yes, he is the immortal person, eternal father of our Korean people. We don't think that he passed away.
The great leader ruled that the army should always come first, and it was fitting that we drove first to the most fortified border in the world, with our minders forever at our sides, down an empty 6-lane motorway. One thing we might all envy here, the lack of private cars means no traffic jams. No peace treaty was ever agreed at the end of the Civil War in 1953, and North and South Korea are still technically at war, with 1 million troops from either side based along the demilitarized zone, with 30,000 Americans in between. I was warned by the North Korean officer in charge that if I put my foot over the white line, I'd be tackled by his men, and if I made it to the next line, I'd be shot by the Americans. I expected to find more tension here after the North was accused recently of sinking a South Korean naval ship, but it all looked very quiet.
It's Sunday, and we all take a rest on Sunday.
A good day to invade.
When the Americans started the war, when they invaded us in 1950, it was also a Sunday. They thought they'd sweep through the country in one day, but during the 3-year war they got a good beating. And if they try and invade again, we'll give them an even greater beating than they got in the 1950s.
In fact, it was North Korean troops who crossed the line in 1950 and thereby triggered a bloody war.
Thanks to the kindness of the great leader, he built civilized housing for all of us and then made this a mechanized model farm, and we are proud of all these things.
Days spent visiting factories and evenings at the theatre, where I sat alongside equally bored-looking generals, watching a ballet about the triumphant building of a hydroelectric dam.
East Asia eventually rose from the ashes of revolution, war, and poverty to become a region where the rate of economic and technological development is envied by neighboring regions. Japan is now considered as a hub for technological development, and so is South Korea. China is now said to have an economy that rivals the United States. Globalization has become a contributor to opening the doors of this region to the culture of the world, where its glorious past intertwines with its present.